I spent 63 years building a life I was proud of. Started with nothing. My father was a machinist in Pittsburgh. My mother cleaned houses on weekends to help pay the mortgage. When I was 19, I drove a used Ford pickup to Charlotte with $400 in my pocket and a trades license I'd earned at night school. By the time I was 45, I owned 3 commercial HVAC companies across the Carolinas. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this so you understand what it meant when I handed my son the keys to all of it. His name is Garrett, my only child. His mother, my late wife, Patricia, died of ovarian cancer when Garrett was 17. After that, it was just the 2 of us. I raised him alone through his senior year of high school, through college at NC State, through his wedding, through the birth of his 2 kids, my grandchildren Lily and James. I was there for every single milestone, and I paid for most of them too, because that's what I thought a father was supposed to do. When Patricia passed, I made her a promise at her bedside. I told her I would take care of our son, that I would make sure he never struggled the way we did when we were young. I kept that promise for 22 years, and I thought I genuinely believed that Garrett understood what it cost me, not just financially, but what it meant. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. Last spring, I turned 67. Garrett and his wife, her name is Tanya, came to dinner at my house to celebrate. Tanya brought a cake from a bakery downtown, one of those fancy ones with the gold leaf on top. Garrett poured bourbon. We sat on the back porch and I watched Lily and James chase fireflies in the yard, and I thought, this is enough. This is everything I ever wanted. Then Tanya said, "We've been thinking about doing something really special for your birthday, George." She paused and smiled at Garrett. Something big. I laughed. I told her dinner was more than enough. But Garrett leaned forward and said they wanted to take me on a trip. A real trip. He said his company had been doing well. I'd helped him get that business off the ground, a commercial real estate consulting firm, and I co-signed on a $200,000 line of credit to give him operating capital in the early years. He said it was time he did something for me. He wanted to take the whole family to Napa Valley. A full week. Wine country. The kind of trip I'd always talked about taking with Patricia but never did. I got a little emotional, I won't lie. I told him that sounded wonderful. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that Garrett had already made the reservations, and that he had made them without including me. I found out on a Tuesday morning in May. My phone rang just after 7. It was Garrett. He sounded distracted, like he was driving or walking somewhere fast. He told me there was a problem with the reservation at the inn. He said the suite he'd booked for me, the one he'd described in detail back in April, had a conflict. The inn had overbooked. My room was no longer available. I said, "Okay, these things happen. Just see what else they have." There was a pause, a long one. "Dad," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." I sat down at my kitchen table. I don't know why, but something in his voice made my legs feel heavy. He told me that he and Tanya and the kids were still going, that the trip was happening, that their rooms were fine, that the suite for me had been dropped back in February when they restructured the booking. He said it in this flat, careful voice, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. I asked him what he meant by dropped. He said, It got removed. It's not a big deal, Dad. We thought maybe you'd rather stay home and relax. You know how Tanya gets when..." He stopped himself. "It's just a lot of traveling for someone your age." Someone your age. I sat there with the phone against my ear, and I did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. I was 67 years old, not 92. I hiked every Saturday morning. I still ran my businesses, but that wasn't even the point. The point was that he had planned this trip, a trip that was supposed to be a gift to me, and somewhere between April and May, I had been quietly removed from it. Not because of an overbooking. Because they had decided I wasn't coming. I asked him one question. "When were you going to tell me?" He didn't have an answer for that. I said I needed to think, and I hung up. I sat at that table for a long time. The coffee I'd made went cold. Outside the window, my neighbor was mowing his lawn. Normal Tuesday morning sounds. and I was sitting there trying to understand how my son, the boy I had raised alone, the boy I had watched grow up in the shadow of his mother's death, the boy I had given a business and a future and a life, had looked at a trip he called my birthday gift and decided I wasn't worth one of the rooms. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have said. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney. His name is Vincent, and he's been my lawyer for 20 years. I told him to pull up everything he had on Garrett's business line of credit. I told him I needed to understand exactly what my exposure was and exactly what my rights were. Vincent asked me if everything was okay. I told him it would be. The thing about building businesses for 40 years is that you learn to separate emotion from action. You learn that grief and anger are real, but they're not strategies. You feel them fully, and then you set them aside, and you do what needs to be done. What needed to be done in this case was a full accounting. I spent 3 days going through records. The line of credit I'd co-signed had been drawn down to $178,000 over the previous 18 months. I'd known about some of those draws. Garrett had mentioned equipment costs, a new associate he'd hired. What I had not known was that $34,000 of that total had gone to what my accountant, a sharp woman named Beverly, described as personal lifestyle expenses: a home renovation, Tanya's car lease, private school tuition for Lily and James, which I had been separately writing checks for every semester, believing those checks were covering what the school tuition cost. I had been paying twice. Beverly laid it all out on her desk and looked at me over her reading glasses and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I want to be clear about something. This was not the story of a father who was surprised to discover his son wasn't perfect. I knew Garrett had always liked money more than he liked earning it. I knew Tanya was, let's say, comfortable with a certain standard of living. I had told myself for years that this was fine, that I was helping, that this was what family did for each other. But there's a difference between helping someone and being used. And sitting at Beverly's desk looking at $34,000 in personal expenses on a loan I was legally responsible for after my son had quietly removed me from a vacation he called my birthday gift, I finally understood that difference. That Friday, Garrett and his family flew out of Charlotte Douglas International. I know because my housekeeper, a kind woman who'd worked for me for 11 years, mentioned that Garrett had called the house asking if I was okay because I hadn't returned his calls. He called the house because I'd stopped answering my cell. I was okay. I was better than okay. I was clear. That weekend, I called Vincent back. I instructed him to begin the process of removing my name as co-signer from Garrett's line of credits. This was not a simple process. It required notifying the bank, providing documentation, going through a formal review. But it was possible, and we began it. I also called the private school. I told them that going forward, tuition payments for Lily and James would need to come from Garrett and Tanya directly. I did not cancel the children's enrollment. I want to be very clear about that. I love those kids. I would not punish them for their parents' choices, but I was not going to keep writing checks to cover expenses that were already being taken from a loan I'd guaranteed. Then I called my estate attorney. I had a will that left the majority of my assets to Garrett outright. I instructed her to restructure it, the businesses, the property, the investment accounts. I set up a trust. The trust would continue to provide for Lily and James directly. College funds, health coverage, a housing provision when they turned 25. Garrett and Tanya would receive a fixed annual distribution, nothing more. My estate attorney, who had known me since I was 40 and was not a woman who showed much emotion, looked up from her legal pad and said, "Are you sure about this?" I told her I'd never been more sure of anything. I did not call Garrett while he was in Napa. I did not send the text. I did not reach out to wish the kids fun at the vineyard or ask how the weather was in California. I simply went about my life. I had dinner with my neighbor and his wife. I went to my Saturday morning hike. I called my sister in Ohio, who I hadn't spoken to properly in months, and we talked for 2 hours. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else's approval of my own life. Garrett came home on a Sunday. I know because he showed up at my front door that same evening, still looking a little tan from the California sun, holding a bottle of wine he'd brought back. Some Cabernet from a winery in Sonoma. He held it out when I opened the door like it was an explanation. I let him in. I am his father. I will always let him in. But I did not take the wine. We sat in the living room. He started talking immediately, the way people do when they're nervous, filling the silence before it can fill with something they don't want to hear. He said the trip had been wonderful, but he'd felt bad the whole time. He said Tanya thought I'd understand. He said he'd meant to call more, but the kids were exhausting and the time difference was strange. I let him talk until he ran out of words. Then I said, Garrett, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. He nodded. I said, when did you decide I wasn't coming on that trip? He looked at the floor. February, he said quietly. 3 months, I said. You let me talk about that trip for 3 months. You let me mention it to my sister. You let me tell my neighbor I was going to wine country for my birthday, and you didn't say a word. He started to say something about logistics, about how he thought I'd prefer the peace and quiet at home. I stopped him. I said, I'm going to tell you what I did while you were gone, and I need you to listen. I told him about Beverly's accounting. I told him about the $34,000. I watched his face change. The tan didn't help him hide it. He went pale underneath it. I told him about the co-signer removal. I told him about the school. I told him about the trust. He interrupted me twice. The second time I held up my hand and he stopped. When I finished, the room was very quiet. He said, Dad, you're cutting me off? I said, I'm restructuring. There's a difference? He said, because of a trip? And that was the moment, right there. When I understood that he still didn't see it, he thought this was about a vacation. He thought I was punishing him over a hotel room. I said, son, it's not about the trip. It's about the fact that you let me believe for 22 years that when you looked at me, you saw your father. And what I found out is that when you look at me, you see a budget line. He didn't say anything. I said, your mother asked me to take care of you. I've done that every single day since she died. The businesses, the credit lines, the school, the down payment on your house, all of it. I did it because I loved you and because I made her a promise. But she never asked me to disappear. She never asked me to make myself smaller so you could be more comfortable. Garrett's eyes were wet by then. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it happened and because it mattered. He said, I didn't think of it that way. I told him I believed him. I told him that was actually the part that scared me most, that he genuinely hadn't thought about it at all. I told him that trust was not a punishment. I told him Lily and James were protected, more protected than before actually, because now no one could make decisions that affected their futures on a whim. I told him that the co-signer removal would take time, and he would need to either refinance the credit line in his own name or pay it down. And that I would give him 6 months to figure it out, which was more than fair. He asked if I was done with him. I said I was not. I told him I was his father, and that would never change. But I said that going forward, I needed him to see me as a person, not an asset. A person with feelings, a person who'd spent 22 years quietly absorbing the grief of raising a child alone, who'd worked every day to make sure that child never felt that grief, who'd gotten up every morning and put his own pain in a drawer because there was work to do. I told him I was done putting my pain in the drawer. We sat there for a while after that. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't a movie ending where everything clicks into place and the music swells. It was just two people in a living room with a bottle of California wine on the coffee table and a lot of history between them. Eventually, Garrett asked if he could come back in a few days and talk more. I said yes. I told him to come on Thursday. Come for dinner, I said. Bring the kids. He came on Thursday. He brought Lily and James. He did not bring Tanya, which I thought was probably a wise choice for a first visit. The kids were loud and wonderful, and Lily told me all about the vineyard, and James got grass stains on his jeans running around the backyard, and I grilled chicken and made the potato salad Patricia used to make, the one with the whole grain mustard that Garrett had always loved. After the kids went to sleep on the couch watching a movie, Garrett and I sat on the back porch where we'd sat on my birthday. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he'd talked to Tanya. He said some of those conversations had been hard. I told him hard was okay. Hard meant something real was being said. He asked me about the $34,000. He didn't deny it. He said Tanya had been managing the business accounts and he'd known the line of credit was being used but hadn't looked as closely as he should have. He said he was sorry. He said it in a straightforward way that didn't have a lot of decoration on it, and I respected that. I told him the money wasn't the heart of it. I told him the heart of it was that I had needed to feel just once. Like someone was paying attention to me, not to what I could provide, but to me. And instead of that, I'd been erased from a vacation. He nodded. He didn't argue with that. I don't know what happens next with Garrett and me. I know that we're talking. I know that he called me last Monday just to check in. Not to ask for anything, just to check in. Not to ask for anything, just to talk. I know that Lily drew me a picture at school. A crayon drawing of a man with white hair standing in a garden, and Garrett drove it over personally instead of just dropping it in the mail. Maybe that's not much. Maybe after 67 years? It's everything. What I know for certain is this. I spent most of my adult life believing that love meant making yourself invisible, making yourself available, making yourself useful. I thought that's what good fathers did. Maybe it is, for a while. When they're small, when they're young, when they're learning. But at some point, a father has to stand up and say, I am still here. I am not a footnote to my own family's story. I am the first chapter. Patricia would have said it better. She always did it better. She always did. But I think she would have agreed. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. The businesses I built, the money I gave, the years I spent making sure Garrett never had to struggle the way I did. And the honest answer is no. I don't regret any of it. What I regret is the story I told myself about what it all meant. I told myself that generosity without conditions was the highest form of love. And maybe it is, when the person receiving it is paying attention, when they're growing, when they see you as a human being and not a resource. But when they stop seeing you, when you become invisible inside your own family, then generosity without limits isn't love anymore. It's just a slow disappearance. Garrett didn't set out to erase me. I believe that. He didn't sit down one February morning and think, I'm going to humiliate my father. What he did was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to forgive. He simply stopped thinking about me at all. He made a decision about a trip that was supposed to celebrate my life, and I didn't even make it into the conversation. That's not cruelty. That's something closer to indifference. And indifference in a family is its own kind of damage. What I've come to understand is that every choice carries a consequence, not as punishment, not as fate handing down some cosmic verdict, but simply as cause and effect. When you teach someone over 22 years that they can take without giving back, that their comfort matters more than your presence, that your feelings are secondary to their convenience, you are building something. You are building a person who believes that is the natural order of things. I built that. I have to own it. The day I called Vincent, my attorney, I wasn't acting out of anger. I was course correcting. There's a difference. Anger burns fast and leaves nothing useful behind. What I felt that morning was something steadier, a clarity that had been a long time coming. I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be at 67. Not what kind of father I'd been. Not what Patricia would have wanted. Not what the neighbors would think. What kind of man? And I knew that man did not keep writing checks to prove he was loved. That man stood up. The restructured trust, the co-signer removal, the school payments redirected. None of that was about making Garrett suffer. It was about making the situation honest. For the first time in years, the financial reality of our relationship matched the actual reality of it. That's not punishment. That's integrity. What I want anyone to take from this, any father, any parent, anyone who has spent years giving everything they have to someone who stopped noticing, is that self-respect is not selfishness. Setting a boundary is not abandonment. You can love someone completely and still refuse to be invisible. You can be a good father and still say, I am a person. I matter. My presence in this family is not optional. The Thursday Garrett came to dinner with Lily and James. The night was ordinary in the best possible way. Loud kids, grass stains, potato salad. And for the first time in a long time, I sat at my own table and felt like I belonged there. Not because I paid for everything in the room, but because I'd finally decided I was worth showing up for. That's the thing no one tells you about getting older. The work doesn't stop, it changes. When they're young, the work is sacrifice. When they're grown, the work is boundaries. Both take everything you have. Both are worth it.